Rain dripped from my black coat as I stood in Derek's office, still wearing the funeral dress that had gotten soaked at my father's graveside service. The smell of wet earth clung to my shoes, mixing with the sterile office air that suddenly felt suffocating. Derek leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled like he was delivering a sermon instead of destroying someone's life. His voice carried that familiar tone of disappointed authority that made grown adults feel like scolded children. "We're a family here, Laura," he said, each word carefully measured. "And you let your family down." The irony hit like a physical blow. I'd missed one day of work to bury the man who'd raised me, taught me to work hard, and died believing his daughter had built a successful career with people who valued her. "Your absence yesterday caused significant disruption to the Morrison account," Derek continued, shuffling papers like evidence in a trial where I'd already been convicted. "That's unacceptable for someone in your position." Around the office, coworkers pretended to work while stealing glances through the glass walls. They watched in silence as I packed my personal items into a cardboard box, their sympathy mixed with relief that they weren't the ones being sacrificed. That was the day I buried two things, my father, and my loyalty to people who called themselves family but acted like strangers. 8 years I'd given to Wells and Partners marketing. 8 years of covering Derek's mistakes when clients called with complaints he couldn't handle. 8 years of mentoring new hires who'd eventually compete for promotions I'd been promised but never received. I'd been the one working weekends when campaigns went over deadline. The one staying late to fix presentations that Derek would deliver the next morning, taking credit while I sat in the back taking notes like a well-trained assistant. "Laura's the backbone of this team," he'd announced during client meetings, patting my shoulder with the kind of ownership that made my skin crawl. "She keeps us all organized and focused." Backbone. That's what I'd been. The invisible support structure that held everything together while other people got recognition for standing upright. I'd run 3 major accounts single-handedly, trained half the department, and implemented systems that saved the company thousands in efficiency improvements. But backbones are easy to break when people start treating them like furniture instead of essential anatomy. Derek had spent years taking my contributions for granted, assuming I'd always be there to clean up whatever mess he created next. I'd been loyal to a fault, believing that good work would eventually be rewarded with respect and advancement. Instead, it had been rewarded with more work and less consideration. Turns out, spines are replaceable when you've never understood their actual function. I sat in my car in the parking lot, still wearing funeral clothes that felt heavier with each passing minute. The rain had stopped, but water droplets clung to my windshield like tears I was too shocked to shed. My phone buzzed with the HR email that made everything official, voluntary separation agreement effective immediately. Voluntary. As if I'd chosen to be fired for attending my father's funeral. As if grief was a lifestyle choice that interfered with quarterly projections. Text messages started arriving from coworkers who'd witnessed my public execution. Half-hearted condolences mixed with nervous relief that they'd escaped Derek's attention. "So sorry this happened, and maybe it's for the best and you'll land on your feet." None of them mentioned the unfairness. None of them questioned Derek's decision to fire someone for mourning. They were too busy protecting their own positions to risk defending mine. That evening, Derek posted on LinkedIn with the kind of corporate motivation speak that made successful people sound like life coaches. Tough leadership calls to find strong families. Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions to protect the team's future. The post got 43 likes from colleagues who'd smiled at me that morning and watched me pack my desk that afternoon. Professional networking at its finest. Public support for the person with power, private sympathy for the person without it. I didn't cry. Didn't scream. Didn't call Derek to argue about the injustice of firing someone for attending their father's funeral. Rage would have been normal. Grief would have been expected. Instead, I felt something colder and more useful, clarity. I printed the termination letter and filed it in a folder labeled motivation. Right behind it went Derek's LinkedIn post, screenshots of the congratulatory comments, and copies of every performance review that had praised my dedication and reliability. Then I opened a different folder, one I'd been maintaining for years without realizing its potential value: client renewal contacts, phone numbers, email addresses, and relationship histories for every account I'd managed during my 8-year tenure. These weren't proprietary company secrets. These were professional relationships I'd built through competence, reliability, and genuine care for client success. Derek might own the company, but he didn't own the trust I'd earned through years of solving problems and exceeding expectations. My laptop sat open on my kitchen table, cursor blinking in an empty email draft. Outside, the world continued spinning as if nothing had changed. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between getting fired and deciding what came next. If family was off the table, I whispered to my empty apartment, I'd build my own. Some families are born. Others are carefully constructed from people who understand loyalty works both directions. My new office was a corner of my studio apartment, furnished with a card table I'd bought at a garage sale and the laptop Derek's company had forgotten to reclaim during my hurried exit. Coffee went cold while I built a business plan from scratch, fueled by determination and the kind of focused anger that comes from being underestimated by people who should have known better. Freelancing felt natural after years of managing client relationships that Derek had claimed credit for. The phone calls started within days, former clients reaching out with curiosity and opportunities that surprised me with their timing. "Laura, we heard about your departure from Wells," said Patricia from Morrison Industries, the account Derek claimed I'd disrupted by attending my father's funeral. "We've been thinking about expanding our marketing scope. Would you be interested in consulting on some projects?" 3 more calls followed that week. Companies I'd worked with during my tenure at Wells, decision-makers who remembered my contributions even when my former boss had minimized them. Each conversation reinforced what I'd suspected but hadn't dared to hope: my value existed independently of Derek's recognition. My first invoice was modest but meaningful. Payment for 30 hours of strategic consultation that had taken me 3 days to complete, work that would have been spread across weeks under Derek's management structure and charged at rates that reflected overhead I no longer carried. The check cleared on a Friday. That same week, Derek's company lost the Morrison account entirely. Former coworkers began calling during evenings and lunch breaks, their voices hushed like they were sharing state secrets instead of workplace gossip. The conversations followed predictable patterns: nervous small talk, genuine concern for my well-being, then careful information sharing that painted an increasingly clear picture. "He's overworking everyone since you left," whispered Amanda from accounting, calling from her car during what should have been her lunch hour. The Morrison presentation was a disaster. Derek couldn't answer basic questions about their target demographics. "He keeps saying no one's irreplaceable," added Marcus from Creative Services, though his tone suggested he was beginning to question that philosophy. "But we're all doing overtime trying to cover the accounts you used to handle." I listened to these updates with professional sympathy while privately noting that Derek's family was discovering the difference between leadership and management. Good leaders inspire people to exceed their potential. Good managers organize systems that function efficiently. Derek had confused authority with competence for so long that he'd forgotten how to do either. "We miss having you around," Marcus continued. "The whole atmosphere is different now. Tense." I smiled, stirring coffee that had finally stayed warm long enough to drink. "That's unfortunate. I hope things improve for everyone." But privately, I thought, "That's true, Derek. Some of us just upgraded to better working conditions." My first major client was Riverside Realty, a local firm that had been struggling with online engagement despite having properties that should have attracted significant interest. Their previous marketing had been generic and forgettable, the kind of template-based approach that treated real estate like a commodity instead of helping people envision their future homes. I spent 2 weeks studying their market position, analyzing their competitors, and developing a content strategy that highlighted the lifestyle benefits of their locations rather than just listing square footage and amenities. The approach required more effort than standard real estate marketing, but it produced results that spoke louder than industry benchmarks. Within a month, their website traffic had tripled. Inquiries increased by 200%. Social media engagement went from barely measurable to consistently viral within their target market. Most importantly, they closed 4 sales that had been stagnating for months. "This is exactly what we needed," said Kim, their lead agent, reviewing analytics that showed sustained growth rather than temporary spikes. "You've completely changed how people see our properties." They referred me to 3 other agencies within their professional network, each facing similar challenges with traditional marketing approaches that weren't adapting to changing consumer behavior. Word spread through real estate circles faster than I'd expected. That same month, Derek's company lost the Westside Properties account, a relationship they'd maintained for 6 years until client satisfaction surveys revealed concerning gaps in service quality. The sympathy bouquet arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to my apartment with no card or identifying information. White lilies and yellow roses arranged with the kind of professional precision that suggested an expensive florist rather than grocery store flowers. I assumed it was a delayed condolence gift from someone who'd heard about my father's death and my subsequent firing. Corporate sympathy often moved slowly through professional networks, arriving weeks after the events that triggered it. But later that afternoon, a handwritten note appeared under my apartment door, slipped through the gap while I was out meeting with potential clients. The message was brief and anonymous: "You're making us look bad." No signature, no return address, just 7 words that confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Derek had discovered that his former backbone was not only surviving without him but actively competing for the same clients he'd assumed would remain loyal to his company. I reread the note several times, looking for clues about authorship or intent. The handwriting was careful and generic, the kind of penmanship that suggested deliberate disguise rather than natural style. Someone at Wells & Partners was monitoring my success closely enough to know which clients I'd acquired and how my performance compared to their recent struggles. The anonymous threat felt less like genuine intimidation and more like confirmation that I was winning a competition I hadn't realized I'd entered. The call came from Patricia Williams, the former HR director who'd processed my termination paperwork with obvious discomfort. Her voice trembled as she delivered a warning that confirmed my suspicions about Derek's response to my growing success. "Laura, I need to tell you something," she began, clearly calling from her personal phone after hours. "Derek's been asking questions about your client list. He's suggesting to people that you might have taken proprietary information when you left." I laughed softly, not because the situation was funny but because Derek's desperation was becoming predictably pathetic. "What kind of proprietary information could I have possibly taken, Patricia? Client phone numbers that are publicly listed? Project strategies I developed myself?" "That's exactly what I told him," she replied quickly. "But he's talking about pursuing legal action. I thought you should know." The threat didn't concern me as much as it should have. 8 years of careful documentation had taught me to keep receipts for everything, especially when working for someone who claimed credit for other people's achievements. "Thanks for the warning," I said, opening my laptop to review the folder I'd been building since my first week at Wells & Partners. "I appreciate you looking out for me." After hanging up, I opened my file labeled receipts and spent an hour reviewing emails, project timelines, and client correspondence that told a clear story about who'd actually been responsible for the success Derek was now trying to protect. "Good," I whispered to my empty apartment. "That means I'm winning." My laptop screen glowed with evidence that would destroy any legal challenge Derek might attempt. 8 years of meticulous record-keeping had created a timeline that proved authorship of every strategy, campaign, and client relationship I'd developed during my tenure. Email chains showing my initial client outreach. Project proposals written in my voice and style. Performance metrics that correlated directly with my involvement in specific accounts. Client testimonials that mentioned my personal contributions by name. My lawyer friend, Marcus Thompson, reviewed the documentation with the thoroughness of someone who understood both intellectual property law and corporate desperation. "They can't touch you," he said, scrolling through folders that contained more evidence than most patent disputes. "Everything here shows clear authorship and legitimate relationship building. But more importantly, they don't know that yet. The beauty of Derek's position was its fundamental weakness. He was threatening legal action based on assumptions about my methods rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. His confidence came from years of underestimating my competence and overestimating his own authority. "What do you want to do with this?" Marcus asked, gesturing at documentation that could end Derek's bluster immediately. I closed the laptop and smiled. "Let's make sure they find out at the right time. Preferably when it'll cause maximum professional embarrassment. Some battles are won through superior preparation rather than superior firepower." Derek was about to learn the difference between threats and evidence. 6 months after my firing, I hired my first official employee, Megan Sullivan, a former Wells & Partners account coordinator who'd quit Derek's company after watching him claim credit for campaign strategies she'd developed during late-night brainstorming sessions. We rented shared office space in a converted warehouse that attracted creative professionals and small business owners who valued collaboration over corporate hierarchy. The monthly rent was less than what Derek spent on his reserved parking space. "This feels so different from Wells," Megan said, arranging her desk in our sunny corner space. "Like we can actually focus on doing good work instead of managing office politics." She brought more than just talent and experience. She brought intelligence about Derek's increasingly desperate management style and the exodus of clients who'd grown tired of paying premium rates for declining service quality. "You know, he lost the Hartman Industries account last week," she mentioned casually while we reviewed our growing client roster. "They said the final presentation felt recycled and uninspired." More interesting was the news that Derek had just lost his biggest investor, a development firm that had been funding Wells & Partners expansion plans based on revenue projections that no longer seemed achievable. "How's morale at the office?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Terrible," Megan replied. "People are updating their resumes and taking long lunches for networking meetings." The foundation Derek had built on other people's work was cracking faster than he could repair it. The industry mixer felt like enemy territory when I walked into the hotel ballroom where 200 marketing professionals had gathered for their monthly networking event. I'd avoided these gatherings since my firing, unsure whether my reputation had recovered from Derek's attempts to damage it. But success creates confidence that failure can't touch. 6 months of growing revenue and satisfied clients had rebuilt my professional standing in ways that felt earned rather than inherited from company affiliation. Derek stood on the small stage near the bar, delivering what appeared to be an impromptu presentation about leadership and team building to an audience that looked politely bored. His voice carried the same authoritative tone he'd used to fire me, but the content felt hollow and theoretical. I found a seat in the back, unnoticed among the crowd of account executives and creative directors who formed the backbone of our local marketing community. Derek's presentation recycled concepts I developed during our partnership, rephrased slightly but recognizably mine. "Leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room," he declared, clicking through slides that contained strategies I'd outlined in presentations he'd never let me deliver. "It's about building a family culture where everyone feels valued and supported." When he reached the climactic moment of his speech, I stood up slowly and began clapping. Not enthusiastic applause, but slow, deliberate recognition that gradually attracted attention from other attendees. "We're a family here," Derek concluded, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room. The energy in the room shifted as people recognized me and began processing the implications of my presence. Conversations around nearby tables grew quieter as industry professionals who'd heard about my departure from Wells & Partners suddenly understood they were witnessing something more complex than a standard networking presentation. "Wait, aren't you Laura Preston?" asked a woman at the table next to mine, her voice carrying just loud enough to be overheard by people who'd been paying attention to Derek's family-focused rhetoric. "You started your own consultancy, right?" added someone from behind me. "I heard you landed the Morrison account that Wells lost." The recognition spread through the crowd like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. People who'd ignored Derek's presentation suddenly became interested in the dynamic playing out between the speaker and the audience member who'd stood to applaud his comments about family loyalty. I smiled politely and remained standing, my presence serving as silent commentary on the gap between Derek's words and his actions. 6 months of successful independent consulting had rebuilt my professional reputation faster than Derek's whisper campaign could damage it. Near the stage, Derek's PR director leaned forward to whisper something urgent in his ear, her expression suggesting panic rather than professional curiosity. The tide was shifting in real time, and everyone in the room could feel it. Derek's authority had been built on assumptions about my dependence that were proving dramatically false. The call came 3 days after the industry mixer, from Bradley Henderson, CEO of Henderson Retail Group and one of Derek's most prestigious clients. His company represented the kind of national account that smaller agencies competed for but rarely secured. "Laura, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly," he began, his tone suggesting this wasn't a casual conversation. "We've been watching your recent work with interest, particularly the Riverside Realty campaign." Henderson Retail had been working with Wells & Partners for 4 years, a relationship that generated substantial revenue and industry recognition for Derek's company. But recent campaigns had failed to meet performance benchmarks, leading to internal discussions about alternative approaches. "We're considering a strategic shift in our marketing approach," Bradley continued. "Something more innovative and personal than what we've been receiving. Would you be interested in consulting on some projects?" Quietly, of course. The NDA he proposed made sense from his perspective. Large companies rarely announce marketing changes until strategies are fully implemented. From my perspective, it provided protection while I developed approaches that would demonstrate capabilities Derek's team couldn't match. The consulting agreement was straightforward but substantial. 3 months of strategic development work with performance bonuses tied to measurable improvements in customer engagement and sales conversion. 6 weeks later, Derek discovered he'd lost his biggest client when Henderson Retail announced they were exploring new creative partnerships. By then, company revenue had dropped 40%, and his board was asking questions he couldn't answer. Derek's response to losing Henderson Retail was predictably desperate and legally dubious. The cease and desist letter arrived via certified mail, accusing me of using proprietary strategies and confidential client information to unfairly compete with my former employer. The accusations were specific enough to sound serious and vague enough to avoid proving actual wrongdoing. Breach of fiduciary duty. Theft of intellectual property. Intentional interference with existing business relationships. Legal language designed to intimidate rather than pursue genuine justice. My attorney, Marcus, read the letter with the kind of professional amusement that comes from years of handling corporate bullying disguised as legal action. "This is embarrassing," he said, highlighting sections that revealed Derek's fundamental misunderstanding of employment law and intellectual property rights. "He's essentially claiming ownership of your ability to think creatively about marketing problems." Marcus's response was swift and devastating. 3 pages of legal reasoning supported by documentation that proved Derek had been claiming credit for my intellectual contributions for years, not the reverse. Email evidence, client testimonials, and project timelines that established clear authorship of disputed strategies. Within a week, Derek's attorney had withdrawn the cease and desist threat. Shortly after, Derek posted a vague LinkedIn message about being proud of our former team members' success and the collaborative spirit that defines our industry. The retreat was public enough to be noticed by industry professionals who'd been following our conflict, but careful enough to avoid admitting fault or liability. The phone call that changed everything came on a Wednesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly projections for my growing consultancy. Marcus Fleming, Acquisitions Director for Continental Retail Corporation, had a proposal that exceeded my most optimistic business projections. "We've been tracking your work with Henderson Retail Group," he said, his tone suggesting this wasn't a casual inquiry. "The engagement metrics and conversion improvements have been remarkable. We'd like to discuss a comprehensive rebranding campaign for our entire retail division." Continental Retail operated 16 major shopping centers across the Midwest, exactly the kind of large-scale project that Derek had always claimed was too ambitious for anything but established agencies with extensive overhead and corporate infrastructure. The scope was enormous, brand strategy, visual identity, digital marketing, and customer experience design for a company with annual revenue exceeding $2 billion. The kind of project that could establish a consultancy as a major player in regional marketing. What's your timeline for implementation? I asked, already calculating the resources and team expansion that would be required. 18 months for full rollout, Marcus replied. But we want to start with pilot programs in 3 locations within 6 weeks. The contract negotiation took 2 days. The announcement appeared in Forbes 3 days later, featuring a photograph of me shaking hands with Continental's executive team and a headline that Derek would definitely see, "From Fired to Founder, the Woman Who Redefined Corporate Loyalty." The industry gossip network moved faster than social media when news of my Continental retail contract reached Derek's professional circle. By Friday afternoon, I'd heard from 3 different sources about his reaction to the Forbes article. Inside Wells and Partners, chaos was spreading like a strategic virus. 2 senior account executives had already submitted resignations, citing better opportunities at firms that valued innovation over office politics. 3 major clients had initiated reviews of their marketing partnerships, specifically requesting agencies with fresh perspectives and proven results. "He actually punched the conference room wall when he saw your article," Megan reported, having maintained contact with former colleagues who'd stayed at Wells despite the deteriorating work environment. "Left a hole right next to the motivational poster about teamwork." The executive team was demanding explanations for declining revenue and increasing client defections. Board meetings that had once been routine quarterly reviews now felt like damage control sessions where Derek struggled to explain how a former employee was outperforming the company that had fired her. "There's an emergency meeting scheduled for Monday," Megan continued. "Word is they're discussing leadership transitions and strategic restructuring, which usually means someone's getting fired." The irony was perfect. Derek had fired me for prioritizing family over company loyalty. Now his board was applying similar logic to his performance, measuring his value against results rather than intentions. Some families require better leadership than others. Derek was about to learn which kind he'd been providing. Marcus called me on a Friday evening while I was celebrating the Continental contract with my small but growing team. The proposal he outlined was so unexpected that I made him repeat it twice before I fully understood what he was suggesting. "Wells and Partners is essentially bankrupt," he said, reviewing financial documents that painted a clear picture of Derek's mismanagement. Revenue down 60%, major client defections, and overhead they can't sustain. The parent company wants to liquidate assets rather than continue funding Derek's operation. The acquisition opportunity was straightforward. Purchase Wells and Partners client contracts, office space, and remaining staff for approximately what I'd spent on equipment and software during my first 6 months of independent consulting. "You could buy them outright," Marcus continued. "Everything Derek built, for less than what he used to spend on quarterly business dinners." I sat in my office looking out at the city where I'd once answered Derek's phone calls and organized his calendar, processing the possibility of owning the company that had fired me for attending my father's funeral. The decision felt inevitable in ways that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Not punishment for Derek personally, but protection for employees who deserved better leadership and clients who deserved better service. "Send me the acquisition paperwork," I said. "I want to review everything before we move forward." Some opportunities arrived disguised as cosmic irony. I drove to my father's grave on Sunday morning, carrying flowers and questions that only he could help me answer. The headstone was simple granite with his name and dates that bracketed a life dedicated to integrity, hard work, and treating people with respect regardless of their position. "Dad," I said, kneeling on grass that was finally growing back after the funeral service that had cost me my job. "I need to know if I'm doing this for the right reasons." The acquisition paperwork sat in my car, contracts that would make me owner of the company that had fired me for mourning his death. The irony was satisfying, but satisfaction wasn't necessarily the same as justice. "I'm not doing this for revenge," I continued, touching the cold stone that marked where his practical wisdom had been laid to rest. I'm doing it because they'll never do this to anyone else again. The distinction mattered more than the outcome. Revenge was personal and temporary. Systemic change was professional and permanent. Derek had created a workplace culture where family emergencies were treated as voluntary disruptions, where loyalty flowed only upward, where people were expendable furniture in his corporate family narrative. That culture needed to die with his authority to enforce it. I signed the acquisition papers in my car, using his headstone as a witness to promises I was making about the kind of leader I intended to become. The press release went live on Tuesday morning. Preston Consulting acquires Wells & Partners Marketing. Local entrepreneur expands through strategic acquisition. The announcement was professional and understated, focusing on business growth rather than personal history. Industry publications picked up the story within hours, recognizing the narrative elements that made it newsworthy. Successful startup acquiring established competitor, former employee purchasing her old company, and the kind of professional reversal that business journalists love to analyze. Derek didn't realize what had happened immediately. The acquisition had been handled through legal entities and corporate structures that obscured my direct involvement until paperwork was finalized and announcements were official. I spent Tuesday afternoon reviewing employee contracts and client agreements, preparing for transition meetings that would determine who stayed, who left, and how operations would be restructured under new management. The irony of sitting in the same conference room where Derek had fired me wasn't lost on me, but it felt like historical context rather than personal vindication. This was about building something better from the foundation of something that had failed. Wednesday morning, I would walk into Wells & Partners as its owner, carrying authority that Derek had never understood and responsibility he'd never accepted. Some stories end with confrontation. Others end with competence replacing incompetence so quietly that the transition feels inevitable rather than dramatic. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather that makes important conversations feel more significant than they probably are. I dressed professionally but not intimidatingly, carrying myself with the confidence that comes from earning authority rather than inheriting it. The Wells & Partners office looked smaller than I remembered, beige cubicles and fluorescent lighting that suggested efficiency without inspiration. Staff members looked up from their computers with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern as I walked through the space I'd once navigated as Derek's subordinate. "Ms. Preston?" asked the receptionist, her voice uncertain but polite. "Are you here for a meeting?" "Actually," I replied, setting my briefcase on the desk where I'd once signed termination paperwork, "I'm here as the new owner." "It's Mrs. Preston now." The news rippled through the office faster than official announcements could travel. Hushed conversations, surprised glances, and the kind of nervous energy that accompanies major organizational changes spread from desk to desk like professional wildfire. Derek's nameplate was being removed from his office door as I spoke, replaced by temporary signage that read "Management Transition in Progress." The symbolism was perfect, though unplanned. HR staff gathered their files and prepared for conversations about employment continuity, benefit transfers, and the policy changes that would accompany new ownership. For most employees, this represented opportunity rather than disruption. Better leadership, clearer communication, and workplace culture that valued competence over politics. Derek arrived 20 minutes late, coffee in hand and the kind of casual authority that suggested he hadn't yet processed how completely his world had changed overnight. He walked past my temporary workstation without recognition, heading toward his office like any other Monday morning. The confrontation happened in the hallway when he discovered his nameplate missing and his office being prepared for new occupancy. His voice carried the indignation of someone who'd never learned the difference between authority and entitlement. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, loud enough to attract attention from employees who'd gathered near their cubicles to witness whatever was about to unfold. I handed him a folder containing his severance package, mirroring the termination paperwork he'd presented to me 8 months earlier. The documentation was thorough and fair, offering compensation that exceeded industry standards despite his performance failures. "This is my company," he protested, his face flushing with the kind of anger that comes from realizing you've fundamentally misunderstood your situation. I met his eyes with calm professionalism, no satisfaction or malice, just the practical authority of someone who'd earned the right to make decisions about workplace culture and employee treatment. "No, Derek," I replied, my voice carrying clearly through the office space where people were learning what leadership transition looked like when handled with dignity rather than cruelty. "It's family. And you're no longer part of it." He signed the paperwork in silence, his trembling hands suggesting he finally understood the difference between leading people and managing them. I walked through the office that afternoon, visiting the same conference room where Derek had fired me for attending my father's funeral. The space felt different under new ownership, lighter somehow, as if removing toxic leadership had improved the actual air quality. My father's photograph found a place on the desk that had once belonged to the man who'd punished me for mourning his death. The simple frame contained more than a family snapshot, it held a promise about the kind of workplace culture I intended to build. "We made it, Dad," I whispered to his image, thinking about dignity and respect and the way that good leadership creates families rather than destroying them. A soft knock interrupted my reflection. Amanda from accounting stood in the doorway with the kind of nervous excitement that accompanies major announcements. "Mrs. Preston? CNN just called. They want to interview you about the acquisition and your employment philosophy. Something about redefining corporate family values." The request wasn't surprising. My story had elements that business media loved: resilience, innovation, and the kind of professional reversal that proved competence eventually wins over politics. But more importantly, it provided a platform to discuss leadership principles that could influence how other companies treated their employees. "Schedule it for Thursday," I said. "And make sure they understand we'll be discussing workplace culture, not personal vindication." The CNN interview aired on Friday morning, reaching an audience that extended far beyond marketing professionals and business owners. The conversation focused on leadership philosophy rather than personal drama, emphasizing principles that could improve workplace culture across industries. "They said we were family," I explained to the interviewer, sitting in my office with my father's photograph visible in the background. "I learned that real families don't abandon you when you're grieving. They stand with you during difficult moments and support you through transitions." The response from viewers was immediate and overwhelming. Messages from employees who'd experienced similar treatment, small business owners who wanted to implement better family leave policies, and managers who were reconsidering their approach to work-life balance. My company had already established grief support initiatives for employees, including paid bereavement leave that extended beyond immediate family members to include chosen family and close friends. The policy had cost nothing to implement but had generated loyalty that went far beyond industry standards. "What's your advice for leaders who want to build genuine family cultures?" the interviewer asked. "Start by treating people's real families as priorities rather than inconveniences," I replied. "Support them during emergencies, celebrate their milestones, and remember that professional success means nothing if it comes at the expense of human decency." After the interview, my HR director asked a question that had been pending since the acquisition: "What should we do with Derek's Leadership Award plaque?" I hung a framed quote above my desk where Derek's motivational posters had once reminded everyone about teamwork and dedication. The words were simple but meaningful: "We're a family here." Underneath, I added a line in gold lettering that clarified the distinction between rhetoric and reality: "Some of us just choose better families." The office culture transformed over the following months as employees discovered what it felt like to work for leaders who understood that family values extend beyond corporate slogans to actual human support. Productivity increased, turnover decreased, and client satisfaction reached levels that Derek's authoritarian approach had never achieved. Preston and Company became the official name, honoring both my father's influence and my commitment to building something that would outlast any individual personality or ego. The ampersand represented partnership, between leaders and employees, between company values and personal principles, between professional success and human decency. Looking out my office window at the city where I'd once been fired for prioritizing family over corporate convenience, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something worth preserving rather than maintaining something that should have been dismantled years earlier. Derek had fired me for grieving. In response, I'd built something worth living for. The best families, it turned out, were the ones you chose carefully and led with integrity, where loyalty flowed in all directions and people were valued for their humanity as much as their productivity. Some lessons can only be learned by losing everything and discovering what you're actually capable of building from nothing.